We're going to continue our discussion now by talking about the pancreas. We've already discussed the pancreas a little bit when we talked about the GI tract, and the pancreas produces a lot of pancreatic enzymes which are important for digestion, and as well as hydrochloric or bicarbonate, which neutralizes the hydrochloric acid. But the islets of Langerhans, which are clumps of cells within the pancreas, produce what's known as insulin. Most of you have probably heard of insulin. Insulin is produced to control blood sugar, and its principal function is to lower the level of blood sugar. If the blood sugar goes up, the insulin goes up and has multiple effects that lead to the decrease in blood sugar. So insulin is the hormone that lowers blood sugar, and glucagon, which is another hormone produced by pancreas, is a hormone that raises blood sugar. So together, these two hormones act to keep blood sugar homeostasis in a very narrow range. Diabetes mellitus, which is something probably most of you have heard of, is a disorder where the pancreas produces an inadequate amount of insulin, which results in high blood sugar. The adrenal glands are two glands that are right above the kidneys. These produce several hormones. The center or medullary area of the adrenal gland produces epinephrine. Epinephrine is known as the fight or flight hormone, which means that it revs up all the systems in the body so that the body can either run away from danger or protect itself from danger. It also produces a series of separate part of the adrenal gland produces a series of steroid hormones which come from cholesterol and are responsible for their protecting us during times of stress. Cortisol is probably the most common, and it is known as the stress hormone as well as helping with healing of injuries. An Addison's disease is a disease that occurs when there's a deficiency in cortisol. Aldosterone we mentioned when we talked about the kidneys. It is the third hormone I'll mention that is produced by the adrenal gland. It stimulates the kidneys to conserve sodium. So the adrenal glands are right above the kidneys, and as I said, there are three areas of the adrenal gland. The medullary area produces the epinephrine. The cortical area, the inner cortical area, produces cortisol, and then the outer cortical area produces aldosterone. The pineal gland is in the brain, and it regulates the wake-sleep cycles. It responds to light and dark and produces a compound known as melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone that is important for sleep induction. And so the pineal gland is right here. So the adrenal gland is toward the front of the brain. It's really in the middle of the brain. Here's the optic chiasm where the optic tracts both cross. Here's the brainstem. So the pineal gland is kind of the caboose back here. It sits back here and produces melatonin. So again, this slide reviews all the things that we have just talked about. You have the hypothalamus that produces various compounds. These are all compounds that I actually haven't mentioned. Hypothalamus also produces pitocin. These are other hormones it produces. You do not have to know these. Here's the pineal gland with melatonin. The pituitary with the various hormones produced by, I didn't mention MSH, that's melanocyte stimulating hormone. It is important in production of melanin in the skin. The thymus produces a compound called thymopoietin, which is important in lymphocyte production. We talked about the thyroid gland. We talked about the adrenal gland. We didn't talk about the testis or the ovaries, but we have the pancreas here. So now we're going to move on to talk about the reproductive system. The reproductive system in humans is fundamentally sexual reproduction. And you'll recall in the first quarter we talked about the difference between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction requires the union of two entities or two cells, one from the male called the sperm and one from the female called the egg. And in humans, the sperm comes from the testis in the male, the egg comes from the ovary in the female. These are also known as gametes, and fertilization occurs when the sperm and the egg unite in the woman to produce a zygote or a baby. The reproductive system is entirely designed to bring this about, to bring about the process of producing new individuals. So the gonads is just another term for female organs, male and female organs that produce gametes. The male gonad is called the testis, the female is called the ovary. These are part of the endocrine system because they produce hormones. The male produces testosterone, the female produces estrogen. These are the male and female produce low levels of these hormones during infancy and childhood. And then at adolescence is a time when these change in a significant way and they begin to produce a great deal more of the hormones that are consistent with being an adult. And this change is known as puberty. And puberty is the stage when the sex organs in the male and the female become capable of reproduction and develop into their adult form. And this process of puberty is associated with what's known as secondary sexual characteristics, which are many of the changes that are associated with either a woman or a man. A woman develops a certain body habitus, voice, and hair distribution. The male produces a different body habitus, voice, and hair distribution. So the male reproductive system is the gonad or testis, the tubes that lead to the prostate gland, and then out through the urethra. So it's made up of the testis, which is the male gonad, which produces testosterone as well as sperm production, and then something called the vas deferens, which transfers the sperm from the testis to the urethra. And this material is known as semen. And the semen, the nutrition part comes from the prostate gland, and the nutrients support the sperm during the time that they're in the transfer process. And then the passage outside is the same passage in a male that they also pass urine. The female reproductive system consists of the ovary, which is the female gonad producing eggs, the fallopian tubes, which are these tubes that go from the egg to the uterus, and the egg that's produced is swept up into the fallopian tube and then travels down the fallopian tube to the uterus. And the hormone that's produced by the ovary is the estrogen, which is the primary female hormone. The uterus is the site of egg implantation and fetal development after fertilization, and the uterus has a great capacity to expand in size. The cervix here is the passage that the child comes out when it's being born. If there's no fetal implantation, then the lining of the uterus, which has been preparing for the implantation of a fetus, is lost, and this process is known as menstruation. This shows the various changes in the female during the 28-day menstrual cycle. And you start at day 0. Day 14 is the day of ovulation, and day 26 to 28 is the initiation of menstruation. And what you see is a change, a significant change in hormonal levels. You can see the change in the ovary. The egg gets larger and larger until day 14, when the ovulation occurs and the egg is spit out. Then this evacuated site then becomes what's known as the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum produces a specific hormone, progesterone, which helps prepare the uterus for implantation. What happens during this time to the body temperature is there is a small but detectable increase in temperature at the time of ovulation. This is associated with both a spike in the luteinizing hormone, which is the hormone that also prepares the uterus, as well as a spike in the FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone. Estrogen levels are at their peak at the time of ovulation, and then they fall off. And then the corpus luteum, under the influence of LH, produces progesterone, which prepares the uterus, and you can see that the uterine lining becomes thicker and more vascular after ovulation. And this is so that if a fertilized egg comes through here, it will implant and receives significant nutrition immediately. After the union of the gametes, new life starts, and this is known as conception. During the time from conception to birth is the gestational period or gestation, and this is divided into trimesters. Each trimester consists of a 3-month period, and there are 3 3-month periods before the child is born. The embryo or unborn baby during the first 8 weeks, the unborn baby during the first 8 weeks is called an embryo. Then it moves to being called generally a fetus, and then finally a child. Fertilization or conception occurs primarily in the fallopian tube, and then the fertilized egg, which will divide several times to eventually form what's called a blastocyst, which is a hollow ball of cells. This blastocyst is what implants into the uterine wall. Implantation occurs when this blastocyst attaches itself and essentially is buried into the uterine wall. And at that point it begins to form a membranous sac known as the amniotic sac around the developing embryo. Inside that sac is fluid that protects the baby during gestation. And so here you have the act of fertilization, then the blastocyst occurs along this line, and here's the mature blastocyst. This is what implants, and then from that point forward, the baby develops along these lines. The baby is essentially fully developed at the end of the first trimester in terms of arms, legs, organs, etc. And most of what happens after the first trimester is a fine-tuning of the development part and an increase in size. The last trimester, the third trimester, is almost entirely just an increase in size. Now, in the child, there are 3 primary germ layers. When I say in the child, I mean in the embryo, in the early stages of development. The ectoderm is the outer layer of the embryo. This eventually develops into the nervous system, sensory organs, and the epidermis. The mesoderm, or middle layer, becomes the organs of the body, the muscle, bone, blood, and dermis. And then the endoderm is the inner layer, and it becomes the GI tract, the respiratory tract, and the urinary tract. The placenta is an organ that actually consists of both fetal and maternal materials or cells. And it is the organ that takes nutrition from the mother and transfers it to the child. So it's the tissues of both people, both the mother and the child, are part of the placenta. And there's a membrane that's produced by the child called the chorion, and then the umbilical cord comes from that and connects the placenta to the baby. Then once the child is ready to be born, we have the process of labor, which is the process of actually delivering the child into the world. And at the point when the child is born, the umbilical cord is cut, and what's left after the umbilical cord is cut and dries up is called the umbilicus.